This is your weekly fix. I'm Smita Nair. You may be familiar with the term mai-baap culture. It means the average citizen doesn't have rights, but is at the mercy entirely of the goodwill of the powers that be. In some cases, it takes the shape of a benevolent dictatorship. Well, that culture is endemic to India's sports federations. More often than not, these federations are helmed by political heavyweights and are populated by cronies who are in their positions thanks to patronage. Think Brij Bhushan Sharan Singh, UP strongman, six-time BJP MP, president of the Wrestling Federation of India. It is in this context that the stars in India's wrestling firmament, Vinesh Phogat, Sakshi Mallik, Bajrang Punia, Ravi Kumar Dahiya, many others, who command among themselves multiple world championship and Olympic medals, took to the streets in protest. They were asking for an end to what they said was a culture of intimidation that stripped them of their dignity and of abuse of power that included sexual abuse and financial misappropriation. Institutionally overlooked, if not sanctioned, abuse in sport is a global problem. Too many perpetrators in too many countries are being protected in too many sports, is how a European PhD researcher in sports ethics described the findings of a study involving over 500 current athletes. Let's try and understand the structural and cultural reasons why this is. Dr. Payoshni Mitra is a leading athlete rights activist. She is CEO, Global Observatory for Gender Equality in Sport. She's been working closely with athletes across Asia and Africa to enable them to address human rights violations in sports. You would, in fact, remember Dr. Mitra as being instrumental in assisting our athlete Duti Chand at the Court for Arbitration of Sport. She was also one of the 10-member team who testified for South African Olympian Caster Semenya at the CAS. Thank you for agreeing to this conversation, Dr. Mitra.
Thank you for inviting me, Smita.
Right. We'll get to wrestling in a bit, but can we examine the lay of the land first? In 2020, Dr. Mitra, journalist Mihir Vasavda of the Indian Express sought and obtained through RTI and other sources data for an entire decade of complaints of sexual harassment with the Sports Authority of India and what came of it. Please permit me to read to you the opening lines of his report. In January 2014, five girls at the Sports Authority of India Training Center in Hisar accused their coach of groping and kissing them on the pretext of celebrating World Kiss Day. The girls, all minors, filed a police complaint against the coach, but it was later withdrawn after the village panchayat intervened. 3 years later, a Sai Sexual Harassment Committee found the coach guilty, but by then, however, the coach against whom multiple cases of misconduct since 1981 had been reported had retired. His punishment, the reporter says, 10% cut in pension for 1 year. Additionally, Dr. Mitra, the reporter found that in a majority of cases, either investigations went on for years without any resolution, or in the ones that came to a conclusion in favor of the complainant, the perp was let off without sometimes not even a slap in the wrist. In most cases, the punishment was transfer, which meant that this perp continued to be in a position of power around young men and women at some other center. My question to you is, could you sort of talk to us about why this is the case? Could you examine this?
Thank you for the question, Smita, and for referring to these cases because these are not one off cases. Over and over again, when I spoke to athletes or even women coaches who have experienced abuse in different setup in sport, have told us that there hasn't been really any use of complaining because either it is postponed for a long time or as you have mentioned just a transfer or a minor fine. It has not really resulted in a real sort of punishment which will be exemplary to others, and before anyone tries to humiliate anyone, any woman, any girl, they would think about it twice. It's not what we do in sport, and it has happened over and over again. So what you mentioned, I'm not surprised at all by that because that's the kind of stories even I gathered when I did my research. So, yes, this is something that we need to change, because if you have those kind of people, I mean, for example, in several countries in the West, we see there are list of people who have criminal records. Now, the moment someone has done something like this, that person need to be in criminal records. And I think there is a need to make formal complaints to the police, and it shouldn't be only the ICCs in respective centers who look after these, but even within the ICCs, you have to have a more stringent punishment. There has to be a criminal record of these coaches. That has to be there. What kind of punishment? You're sort of having vulnerable adults, young girls, young boys as well, who are relying on these coaches, and you have to make sure that the sports space is safe. So, how much have you been able to do that? Is a big question. However, the recent case that we have seen, as you just mentioned in your introduction, in some very strange way, gives me hope, because it tells you that someone like Vinesh Phogat, who has not experienced sexual abuse herself in this case, is speaking up for other younger women. Now, obviously, this is an investigation that will go ahead. We will have to see how that is done. But at the same time, I think what gives me hope is that someone is standing up for another person. And we haven't seen this happening much in Indian sport, where there you always see that there is this culture of subservience among athletes. There is this culture of obeying, where you are not supposed to question the authority of a coach, of an administrator, of anyone in power. So here we see that being sort of disrupted, and that gives me hope that, okay, an athlete like Vinesh Phogat, Sakshi Mallik, Bajrang Punia coming up and talking about it, speaking up for other younger athletes, meaning that they are not ready to bystand anymore. They're not going to accept what is going on, even if it's not something that's on them. So, this is what I think is crucial. And I hope this sets an example for other individuals in sport who are known for sort of bystanding. I mean, there is so much bystanding in sport across the world, where people might not be committing crime themselves, but even if they're aware of criminal activities, even if they're aware of abuse, humiliation of young women, girls, and boys, children, by coaches or administrators, they just don't say anything because they are somehow scared of complaining. So that, for me, that gives me some hope that these young women, both Sakshi and Vinesh, whom I have seen closely in the national camp many years back, have had the guts and the courage to come and speak up.
Right. Dr. Mitra, at the end of our conversation, I'm going to circle back to the significance, as you sort of briefly now alluded to, of this moment. But as a follow up to it, and looking at the sort of larger picture that exists across various sports and at different levels, not necessarily at the level of elite level as Vinesh and Sakshi and Bajrang are at. Again, I want to read from the same report I'm referring to. It was a series of reports. The reporter Mihir quotes the former DG of the Sports Authority of India, Gigi Thompson, as saying that you refer to how there is no reporting very often because there is no clear reporting structure in place, or the athlete feels that perhaps it's not going to get her the you know the resolution that she's looking for. Here's what the former DG, the top man inside, said in that interview. He said athletes often withdraw their complaints or change their statements because they fear their careers would be impacted, which makes it difficult for them to take action. He means SI authorities, because he says there's not always cooperation from the athlete who initially makes the complaint but subsequently says, I want to take it back. He says most of these girls come from humble backgrounds, so they are either persuaded or pressurized to change their statements or to take back their complaints. the girls give in to the fact that their future in sport, which is for many a way out of poverty, is in the hands of, in this case, he's talking about coaches. So often they give up. Now, I would say it is a cop out on the part of the former DG Sai, because the Sai is a fairly powerful body. And if a young minor athlete has made a complaint, or even if a young woman has made a complaint and then subsequently withdrawn, they are well within their rights to investigate the matter nevertheless. But having said that, this is an issue, isn't it? We heard Vinesh Phogat in that press conference as well say, "I fear for my life." She said, "That now that I have come out and I have spoken." I mean, that really cuts to the nub of the matter, doesn't it?
Yes, and I mean, Mr. Thompson and I had the opportunity to work very closely with him around Duty Chand's case, and he is actually one of those extremely outspoken, director generals I have seen while working in India, and what he says is definitely the truth, being in that position that he was for several years. And I did notice that Vinesh uh, mentioned that she feels that it's really for her tomorrow. She doesn't know if she will be alive, what kind of pressure she will be under, that she is taking that risk of being unsafe. And this is Vinesh Phogat, who's quite big in India, talking about how this can impact her life, her career, everything. And I'm sure younger women, as Mr. Thompson rightly pointed out, are under this pressure. And we know several of our athletes come from really ordinary background, and for them, a lot more is at stake. If they are told that if you take this up, your career is finished, it is a big deal for them. And which is why you will see many athletes talk about abuses that they have, they endure for a long time, but they do talk about much later, because it really takes that long, and you are in that atmosphere where you are not going to get support, and everyone is kind of normalized this kind of atmosphere, sort of culture of abuse. And then you don't feel that even if you speak up, anything is going to happen to you. As an athlete, as a young athlete myself, I have been part of such a very abusive, sort of physically and verbally abusive atmosphere in sport myself, and I experienced it. But it was so hard for us too to talk about it. Some of us dropped out from sport because of this reason. Some of us didn't and endured the kind of physical and verbal abuse that was inflicted on us. So this is something that is often normalized in sport, and not only in Indian sport but across the world. If you look at other cases, if you see what happened with gymnastics in the US, for example, all these gymnasts, extremely successful gymnasts, came out talking about it much later in their lives. And it was only when they could come together, one person supporting another, that it was possible for them to really protest. But for the longest time, you feel that you're not able to do that because that's the structure you're in for sport, as if you are training for sport and if you're training for your country, you have to endure whatever the pain is. And that kind of a culture in sport where you are supposed to bear all this pain, that kind of extends to these kind of abusive things which happen, and athletes feel that they can't talk about it at all. And we also need to understand the entire spectrum of abuse. In this particular case, for example, you have evidence of this man being physically abusive to other athletes, a male athlete. I saw it on video myself. So you have to see that he is part of this extremely sort of abusive culture that he has created around him, and somehow normalized it as something that is acceptable. And to come up and talk about it, speak up and say, no, what you are doing to us is wrong, needs a lot of courage. And hardly anybody will be able to do that. If you're young and if you want to move ahead in life, you don't think anyone's going to come and support you at all in sport. And sport particularly creates this kind of an atmosphere because of how the coach athlete relationship is. or the focus in certain sports more particularly. For example, in wrestling, which is a traditional sport, even if you go to the men's camp, you will see how, you know, wrestlers behave towards anyone who is senior. There is this idea of obeying, which is extremely important. There is this idea of, that I mentioned, the culture of subservience, which is so important. So if you believe in that as an athlete, you're supposed to listen to whatever you're being asked to, because you have a larger goal of achieving something for your country. And therefore, while you are doing that, you stop questioning a lot of abuse that's being inflicted on you. At what point are you going to raise your voice? Even if you raise your voice, is someone going to listen to you? So there are these all kinds of questions that young athletes um, sort of live with, and often they don't have an answer, because the information that we have around, complaint processes, whether there is any recourse, these are not very clear to athletes either.
Right. Um, Dr. Mitra, you're part of this global discourse on athlete safeguarding. My question is, are the reasons that allow for rampant abuse in these setups the same in India, in your experience? You said that it is global, but are the reasons, structurally, the reasons, are they the same in India as you see it globally? And what do you think? What is the thinking globally, in your opinion, on how to definitively address this problem of abuse? One has heard of this concept of external oversight mechanism. Could you tell us what that is and if that can indeed work?
I think, structurally, sport creates that kind of, as I said, structurally, sport is very hierarchical, and that creates these possibilities of abuse. And that is common in everywhere, everywhere in the world. There are enough number of harassment cases that we hear from, even in global north countries, with way more sort of mechanism in place. So I wouldn't say this is particularly something about India. It is there across, across the entire sort of, you will find it anywhere in the world. Um, However, I think the way our structures in sport are, at this point, where there is very little accountability of people who are in power. They're not accountable to anyone, which is why you see the same people leading our federations for several years. They reach a point where they become this invincible, untouchable sort of a figure where you can't really question them. And that has often happened in India over and over again. Now, has this not happened anywhere else? Yes, it has. But I think there are, gradually with time, there are better systems in place where you are restricting people from extending their regime from more than 10 years or something, so that you can sort of restrict such things from happening. But we obviously in India at this point do not have such regulations in place, which would make sure that a person cannot be the president of a federation for that long. If a person has some criminal records, he cannot continue. If a person has openly being violent to someone, that person is accountable. We don't have that system in place, and that is something we need to work on. In Indian society and other institutions, there are system in place, but sport, I would say, particularly is behind.
Right. A couple of questions to end our conversation. I came across a roundtable conversation you had with young girls, I think junior national athletes across different sports. The conversation is in Bangla, so I'm a language I'm not entirely conversant in. I got a bit of it though. Now, there are thousands of vulnerable children like the ones you were talking to who are negotiating this system you're talking about every single day. My question to you, Dr. Mitra, is what did you? Is there something that has stayed with you, not particularly from this conversation, but from conversations with athletes who are just starting out in these junior national camps and their fears? Also, what have you heard from parents? I'm assuming that that is a stakeholder that you have engaged with in the course of your research too. Is there a sort of a reluctance now to send particularly girls out into, potentially difficult situations such as this?
I was in another part of the world recently speaking to young women, and we were sort of discussing the same things, that one particular negative experience is, can have such a huge impact on these girls' lives, because many of these girls are anyway fighting several barriers to be where they are. Now, if that space is now seen to be an unsafe space, will their parents be okay to still allow them to be there? And it adds to the number of barriers for them to access sport. And though even those who are not, experiencing any abuse directly, for them as well, it might be a barrier to know that these things happen in sport. So it's our collective responsibility to make sure that we are providing a safe space for girls and women. A lot of other debates are on right now, for example, around fairness, etc., in sport. But what should be the first thing that we must ensure as people who are committed to sport and the sport ecosystem is safety. Safety must come first, whether it's for a girl or a boy, or a young woman or a young man. Are our sporting hostels safe enough? Are our athletes safe enough? The idea of safeguarding, which is now gaining momentum across the world, how much have we done about that in the context of Indian sport? Are we doing enough? The investigation that is going to now happen on the particular case that we were discussing, I wonder how that investigation is going to be done. Who are going to investigate? These are important questions which we raise on whenever there is such a case coming up anywhere in the world. Who is investigating? Are these people independent enough to investigate? Do they have the sensitivity to deal with such complex issues of abuse? Are we asking these questions in the context of the committee that has been created by the ministry? These are important elements that each of these people who are part of these investigative committee should have sensitivity towards the the people who are raising this issue. It's not about, for example, anti-doping, where you are raising questions, you can ask any questions, we're thinking they are cheaters. No, these are women and men who feel they have been victimized. How you interview them, how you investigate this issue is very different from investigating something like anti doping, for example, or corruption, for example, right? So, that kind of a sensitivity that you expect when it's about harassment and abuse. Do these members have that? Do they understand enough? Do they know enough about these issues? Do they have the knowledge? Do they have, are they independent enough is another big question. You need an independent committee to be able to investigate. So all these questions are important for the media to raise when it comes to any such cases in Indian sport. And I'm so glad that you are doing that through your program.
Right. Very quickly, before I let you go, Dr. Mitra, you already spoke in the beginning of this program of the significance of this moment of a Vinesh Phogat coming out and talking about abuse that she did not necessarily face firsthand, but speaking on behalf of athletes who don't have the agency and the voice and the platform she has. My question is: was this investigation to not go in favor of the athletes who protested? Would that would that determine the significance of this moment, this revolt, or do you think whatever the result of the investigation may be, the very fact that these people came out of the streets and spoke their truth itself is significant?
I'm an athletes' rights person, Smita. So my heart is slightly, I want, is towards that idea that these athletes have had the courage to come up. So that's the moment that I would really cherish in my heart. And having spoken to and met with and interviewed Sakshi as well, you're mentioning Vinesh, who I know was more outspoken, but Sakshi Malik is also, having known her many years back, I think the fact that she's been there to support Vinesh is something really important. And there are two Olympic medalists out there protesting. This has never happened in Indian sport. We have so very few Olympic medalists, and among them we have two of them sitting there protesting along with Vinesh. It is huge, and I think. It also tells you in some ways how much they have been pushed to the corner to be, to really finally come out and do this. Obviously there is investigation that will take place, but I would really hope that the investigation is done in proper terms. And this is something that even as a part of my organization, we are very interested in, that whenever investigations take place, whether they are taking place in the right way, because we are very conscious of the power structures in sport and how that can impact investigations as well. And I will really hope that this time that doesn't happen and we have an independent group of people giving us a decision which is right and not in favor of any particular uh, person in power.
All right. Dr. Mitra, I appreciate your insight and your time. Thanks so much for joining us here on Scroll.
Thank you so much.
Right. And a quick word before we go to our viewers. Scroll turns 9 today, and we've launched a Scroll membership, which allows for certain privileges. You can see the details in the bottom of your screens. Also, hear from our editor.
Scroll has turned 9. We'd like to thank the millions of you who rely on us each month to bring you insightful reportage and perspectives that you don't usually see in the rest of the media. As we enter our 10th year, we have a big announcement. We are launching a membership program. While we remain committed to keeping our public interest journalism free to access, we believe it's time for us to deepen our relationship with you by offering you special privileges as a paying member. Your membership will enable us to continue reporting stories that speak truth to power. It will also unlock privileges for other readers who might not be able to afford them. We're counting on your support as we go into our 10th year, focusing on the news that matters and the things that make life worth living.